Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are, wherever the day finds you. I hope it finds you well, happy, healthy, and ready to learn something. Welcome to the History of Propaganda. We're going to finish up the Rise of the Expert series now. So I'm going to throw part 8, 9, 10, and then we're going to just keep going with everything that I've researched on Brandeis and everything that I've uncovered. Okay. So first, we are going to start with the social justice. Some of you may have read this, but I have not done a video on it, so we're going to do a read through. Okay. And just before we do that, let's show you what it's all going to be based on. So the Profits of Regulation, this is the book that this article is really based on, primarily. Thomas K. McGraw. We'll get into the author here in a second, because knowing who wrote the book is just as important as the information in it. You can see Profits of Regulation. Charles Francis Adams. Now he's in the famous Adams family that are the authors of the Monroe Doctrine. Next is Louis Dembitz Brandeis, and then his clerk, James M. Landis, expert in cover fire. And then we got Alfred E. Kahn, okay, and winner of the Pulitzer Prize in history, Thomas K. McGraw. Okay. And then I'm going to show you some of the provenance I have for Brandeis. And this is just a little bit of it. But these books here, I would suggest to go find. These are all his official biographers or people that have done work for, or done at least his biography or told the story of Louis Dembitz Brandeis. But, you know, the majority of them are siloed. I'd point to Urofsky as probably the most informed. Maybe Arthur S. Link, the author of this, he may know. Brandeis is throughout this because, of course, as you know now, Brandeis was the author of the architect of the New Freedom. Okay, so we're going to tell this history I'm going to put out these 3-4 videos in the next 3 or 4 days, because the history has never been more important, and this all ages so well. Unfortunately, everything that I'm presenting is actually coming into focus. A lot of people pretty late. I'm actually surprised on how long it took, or how obvious it had to become for people like the last American vagabond to see what's going on. But most people are still in the dark. So that's what this is all about, because we'd rather people know the real history. So then we can better make decisions as to what we want to see in the future, right? So there's Profits of Regulation. So this is Vanderbilt. He's one of the giants in the railway industry in the 1800s. Key guy to understand here. Because it's all about regulating railway, labor, and later under Landis and Kahn, burgeoning airline industry gets treated the same as the rail industry. So since their onset, the railroad and corporation have been expansionist in worldview. Left to themselves, they grew beyond control. We see the formation of giant corporate trusts in railroads, tobacco, sugar, finance, oil. As the advancements of industry far outpace regulation, born is the era of Morganization and the first questioning of too big to fail corporate power. Many look then to bigness as a solution. For those who've been following along, the Progressive Era set the foundations for a bureaucratic, scientifically governed society formerly known as the administrative state, or derogatorily as the welfare or nanny state. So, and as we've shown, most specifically in Brandeis Part 6, the science of law, regulatory and legislative lawmaking are two very effective yet very underappreciated forms of social control. These are the systems and the mechanisms of which the New World Order have established a modern day industrial democracy, soon to be post-industrial age. So here's a short story on the most impressive four regulators in American history. So in his telling of the making of the modern U.S. administrative state, Thomas K. McGraw, professor emeritus business history at Harvard Business School, names four historical figures most integral to its creation and whose collective regulatory influence spans well over a century. Charles Francis Adams Jr., Louis D. Brandeis, James M. Landis, and Alfred Kahn. So McGraw first mentions Charles Francis Adams Jr. from the famous Old English Bostonian Adams family and a graduate of Harvard Law School himself. He was a colonel and a brigadier general in the Union Army, a direct descendant of two U.S. presidents and son of Abraham Lincoln's ambassador to the United Kingdom. More on him later. And what a century to be a regulator. McGraw's Pulitzer-winning story of the four prophets spins a contiguous thread through some of America's most tumultuous eras. William Henry Vanderbilt and the early 19th century robber barons, American Civil War Reconstruction, the Mexican and Spanish-American Wars, and then, of course, the 20th century Progressive Era reform, the First and Second World War, the New Deal, Cold War, policies of the 50s and beyond. These are the four men most responsible for first cracking the whip on the American horse, taming a once unfettered spirit into one of the most domesticated. Sorry, let me try that again. These are the four men most responsible for first cracking the whip on the American horse, taming a once unfettered spirit into one of domesticated servitude. So as chairman of the Massachusetts Railroad Commission and later president of Union Pacific Railway, Adams's regulatory career focused on, one would expect, mainly on the railroads. He was a nationally recognized authority of regulation, instigating the Massachusetts Railway Commission in 1869. You can see he's being depicted in the background as a colossus. Like they did roads, like they did Cecil roads, the turn of the century, and like they're doing to Trump right now. So this is all related to the Monroe Doctrine and what we're hearing coming out of the Oval Office. So there's John Quincy Adams. He's one of the authors of the Monroe Doctrine. He looks like he has your best interests at heart. Does he not? Okay, so Adams was prominent during the Reconstruction period right after the Civil War in the regulation of railroads. His grandfather, John Quincy Adams, was a Federalist fan of centralized administrative or scientific government and Secretary of State under who else but James Monroe. And together the two were the very authors of, you guessed it, the Monroe Doctrine. So it's his grandfather. It's the author. This guy. That's the grandfather. Do we have a picture of... We actually don't have a picture. Just on the Prophets of Regulation. And this is Charles Francis Adams, his grandson. To Adams, quote, the industrialization of America had gained a momentum independent of human will, end quote. Technological determinism was shaping society and the government was falling behind, quote, a serious institutional lag had opened up between corporate development and public response to it. As a consequence, private and public interests were out of balance, end quote. What was needed was, quote, an expert, a permanent apolitical body, in brief, a regulatory commission. Progress at any price is the watchword of the present, end quote. Page 8 from Profits of Regulation. So you're starting to see that there's this ominous continuity of scientific governance going way back, and they're using the same terms: efficiency, experts, governing bodies, commissions. Okay, commissions and committees, they don't have no punitive power. Remember, they're investigatory and advisory. So the entire Adams plan have progress written all over them, and Charles Francis Adams Jr. already fitting right in with the rest of Lincoln's key men of progress: Gilpin, Grant, Sherman, Alfonso Taft, and so on. As all Union Army members did, Adams literally fought for and in the very name of progress, at least the progress that we've been defined now, but more on the connections between Brandeis and Lincoln later. So the modern colossus of railroads, this is what the cartoon in the background is called. 1879 political cartoon in Puck magazine. A giant William Henry Vanderbilt, son of Cornelius, president of the New York Central Railroad, stands straddling U.S. railroads. Smaller figures of Cyrus Westfield, founder of American Telegraph Company, of the New York Elevated Railway Company, and Jay Gould of the Union Pacific Railroad stand at his feet. Jay Kepler is the artist, these captains of industry, the inspiration for regulation. And Adams's career spent regulating interstate railroad travel and communication. This cartoon, a reference to the Greek sun goddess or sun god Helios and a former wonder of the world, the Colossus of Rhodes. There is another famous cartoon called The Colossus of Rhodes, in which is depicted Cecil Rhodes's dream of a north-south continental railroad in Africa. This is a scramble for Africa, turn of the century, 1900, little after Adams. So Rhodes is seen in a similar fashion to Vanderbilt, but straddling the continent of Africa, from the Mediterranean Sea to its southern tip. And we have seen within the last week an artist's rendering of the exact same thing, except it's Donald Trump and it's North and South America that he's straddling. And Trump is, if you've been watching, you've seen that he's been using the word or the term Monroe Doctrine and manifest destiny. The first president ever in the history of America to use the term manifest destiny in an inaugural speech. So, So second on McGraw's list is our star protagonist, Louis Dembitz Brandeis. Here to the left, on his way to screw somebody. Not only was Brandeis named by McGraw as one of the most influential figures in the regulation of America, naming him, quote, a patron saint of the whole regulatory tradition, end quote. Remember, this won a Pulitzer Prize. But McGraw also names Brandeis as personal law clerk and protege, James M. Landis, as one of the four main prophets of regulation. This is significant in that it displays an influence beyond that of one man and an interest by Brandeis in not only the continuation into perpetuity of his own precedent-setting legislation and regulation, but also the insulating of his own reputation long into the future, hidden behind the wall of scholasticism. We're going to get into his law clerks. We'll show how he insulated himself, protected himself, and why he still survives today as the people's attorney, and everybody thinks that he's one of the great American U.S. Supreme Court justices, yet it is him most responsible for where we are today. It's from the mind of Brandeis that we see Musk. It's from the minds of American progressives at the turn of the 20th century, from where we get the technocracy, cybernetics, Macy conferences, all the way to today's singularity. There is an ominous continuity, and the only name you can give it is progress. So today, The spell is wearing off, and history shows Landis to be one of Brandeis's primary cover agents. But he was only one of at least 20 other Harvard law students personally groomed under Brandeis, and at least 10 others under Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., his partner, one of his closest friends, and really the person that Brandeis was manipulating and exploiting. So there's a triangular relationship there with Brandeis, Frankfurter, and Oliver Wendell Holmes. And those are three of the most well-known U.S. Supreme Court justices, all openly experimenting on the U.S. Constitution, shifting us away from classic liberalism and our ability to speak freely and think freely to a radical new definition of liberalism. And we see that extrapolated over the 100 years. We are now living in it with radical activist groups like Antifa, BLM, setting fire to cities, creating all kinds of chaos out of which they can create order. So today the spell is wearing off. James Landis is the designer and creator of another regulatory body, independent of government you may have heard of, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. Landis, a protege of both Felix Frankfurter and Brandeis, later writing of his year as clerk under Brandeis as, quote, one of the best years of my life, end quote. Landis would later be selected dean of Harvard Law School and second chairman of the SEC. The SEC, best known for its supervision of Wall Street, but also has jurisdiction over much that people generally don't appreciate, quote, regional stock exchanges, over-the-counter markets, corporate reporting activities, accounting practices, bankruptcies, and public utility holding companies, end quote. This is an extension now of Brandeis's surveillance state. You know, Brandeis is there when they create the US $1 bill with the all-seeing eye and the pyramid on it. I haven't been able to link it to him, but he is right there. Brandeis is really leading FDR's brain trust at this point, and James Landis is a key guy. Establishing New Deal. Landis's greatest contribution to regulation came during the 1930s in his design and administration of the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's from page 53 of the Profits of Regulation. So the people's attorney, you go back into the actual day, they call him the lawyer for all of the people. Pulling those out of Harper's Weekly, Collier's Weekly, from the day. And one of his biographers, from whom I get a lot of information, he actually wrote an article called The Greatest Jew Since Jesus Christ, talking about Louis Brandeis. Frankfurter said that Brandeis was the sage advisor to all, and we're seeing why they're saying that. Nobody better to know it than his sidekick, Frankfurter. So again, from page 53, Profits of Regulation. In the history of liberalism, Landis embodied the generational links from Brandeis to the old progressive through Roosevelt and the New Deal down to John F. Kennedy and the new frontier. He served all three men. Emphasis added by me. So from Harvard Law School, quote, James M. Landis, class of 24, scholar, administrator, advocate, and political advisor, is known for his seminal contribution to the creation of the modern system of market regulation in the United States. As a highly influential participant in the policies of the New Deal, he drafted the statute that was to become the foundation for securities regulation in the US, and by extension, the founding principle of financial market regulation across the world, end quote. Highly influential, and why they're being named as the Profits of Regulation throughout American history. So fourth on the list of most prominent American regulators, according to McGraw, was Alfred E. Kahn a later disciple of the same regulatory philosophy as Brandeis, Landis, and Adams. Kahn graduating Harvard with a master's degree in the liberal arts before he was 20, summa cum laude. Kahn, an economics graduate of Yale, fitting name. From the institutionalist school of thought, his contemporaries were progressive founder Richard T. Ely, New School for Social Research co-founder Wesley Clare Mitchell, and Kahn was influenced by economist, sociologist, and leading progressive intellectual Thorstein Veblen. This guy's name keeps popping up in our story. He's a social engineer, somewhere between a behaviorist and a grand high-level strategist. Kahn took his cues from Veblen. Quote, they studied the sociological and anthropological aspects of such institutions as the leisure class, the business cycle, the capitalist legal system, the labor union, the business corporation, and the regulatory agency. This last institution proved especially important, and many institutional economists interested themselves in regulation, end quote. Yeah, as any economist or shopper knows, price within an economic model is a major influencer of behavior. These are the aspects of controlling our behavior that we don't appreciate. This is why it gets they always get through, because we're just not keen to their idea. We're not thinking deep enough. These are summa cum laudes. So you have to start to build your own understanding and into a knowledge so you can have a perspective, not a perception, like Aldous is asking you to have. Perception largely can be manipulated. Perspective is based in information and personal knowledge and experience from which you can make far more accurate decisions. So, and this may be a window into why we see in the first American fascists, why the one area Brandeis was consulted most by the Council on National Defense and War Industries Board was pricing. So now we address how Brandeis's influence specifically was able to create such widespread and long-lasting systemic change through legislation and regulation, with two very important case studies. First, Brandeis's work with Harvard Law School in creating the modern clerkship model, and secondly, the influence his Brandeis Brief had on not only the world of case law, but social activist civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the ACLU into the 21st century. Frankfurt is one of the founders of the ACLU, and as you're about to see, Brandeis taught these giant social activist organizations exactly how to get things done. Identify an injustice, but the necessary concomitant had to be redress, compensation. So you want to talk about how these activists today seem like a bunch of spoiled little brats, entitled and all of these things? Well, this is where it comes from. This is the very nexus of it all. Brandeis and his Brandeis Brief. This is the creation, the overhaul of our system of law, as we went over in Brandeis Part 6, through something called sociological jurisprudence. And now we've been able to research, and I'm going to put out a new show here soon showing that goes even beyond the German historical school in Germany, Prussia, but back into Frankist origins under Moses de Bruschka, aka Junius Frey. So where we see the coagulation, the congregation, the collection of Jacobins, progressives, radicals, the Illuminati, the Jesuits, the Rothschilds. And it's the actual history. I'm not talking conspiracy theory here. We're actually showing you sources. But more on that later. So now we address how Brandeis's influence specifically was able to create such widespread and long-lasting systemic change through legislation and regulation with two very important case studies. First, his relationship with the law clerks. This is fascinating stuff here. And I'm going to take my time and make sure we don't miss a thing. So, quote, history has not fully recognized the important and lasting contribution that Brandeis made to the development of the institutional rules and norms surrounding the Supreme Court law clerk, end quote. That's from Isaiah and his young disciples, Justice Brandeis and his law clerks, from Todd C. Peppers, and is the article that we see right here. And we are drawing from dissertations and stories told in the higher echelons, the highest echelons of academia, where these authors are siloed. They're only going to understand a certain aspect of Brandeis's life, because God forbid they put it all together like we are showing here. So these are reputable. You can look up Todd C. Peppers. He's probably PhD in some sort of history or law now. You can see that that's where I'm pulling my quotes out of. Somebody that's really studied all of this. So they identify Horace Gray. Yeah, Justice Horace Gray in 1882 started the practice of hiring recent Harvard Law School graduates to serve as his legal assistants. Justice Gray instituted the tradition of hiring law clerks while serving as the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. And one of the young Harvard Law School men Gray hired was Brandeis himself. So nor was Brandeis responsible for much of the early mythology surrounding the relationship between justice and law clerk. It was the magnificent Yankee, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who has summoned a generation of Harvard Law School graduates to serve as private secretaries, social companions, surrogate sons, and caretakers to, quote, God's grandfather, end quote. It would be Brandeis's clerkship model, however, that led to the professionalization of the clerkship institution. From the hiring of his first law clerk, Brandeis demanded that each law clerk have a strong work ethic, possess superior legal writing and research skills, and abide by the fiduciary relationship between justice and law clerk. So what he's telling you there is that, you know, this clerkship model that we're all familiar with, he's a law clerk. It all started with our buddy Brandeis. So I hope you guys can see that well. So while studying directly under Horace Gray, Brandeis was one of the first ever clerks in U.S. history. Brandeis also learning from Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who had also studied under Gray. But more than anyone, it was Brandeis who was the first clerk and the founder of the clerkship model, still followed today. Profound, in that we already recognize Brandeis for not only being the founder of the Brandeis Brief, the main proselytizer of sociological jurisprudence, the founder of Harvard Law Review and Harvard Law School Association, but we now find out Brandeis is also the one who establishes Horace Gray's clerkship model, professionalizing the clerk into the institution we all living today assume was just old tradition. So incredible when you know Brandeis almost famously, not so famously, was the architect of Woodrow Wilson's 1912 New Freedom Campaign, setting the regulatory foundations for modern America by creating the Federal Reserve, the Federal Trade Commission, refitting the Interstate Commerce Commission. So Brandeis Part 1, the New Freedom, we go into all of that. There is far more research that I got to show you guys on all of that, showing how Brandeis manipulated the American people, preconditioned them through all of these progressive magazines like Collier's, Lafayette's, McClure's, American Magazine, Harper's especially. He does 12 articles in a row in the lead up to the creation of the Federal Reserve to propagandize and make popular the idea of a central bank system. So everybody can look to this story here. Calling you out, G. Edward Griffin. Not one mention of Brandeis in all of the editions that he's printed. And never in his professional work or life, in the hundreds of hours I've listened to him, has he ever mentioned Brandeis or the progressives. So this creature from Jekyll Island, while possessing some truth, is a distraction. It's pushing people away from actually what happened. The influence of the first U.S. Supreme Court justice, one of the greatest regulators of all time. You don't just create a central bank system. It has to be regulated and legislated into reality. Not only was Brandeis a technical expert at it, and he'd been doing it for 20 years prior to, he was already in the ear of Woodrow Wilson and about to be the leader of the international Zionist movement. And about 9 years after this, he creates Israel. T-Lab telling you that. Derek Bros telling you that. Richard Grove, he runs when you talk like that. This research is legit, guys. I don't know why everybody missed it. I mean, I do know why, because everybody's distracted. I mean, look at today. And you know a great way to tell if you're being distracted is if your heart rate's getting up and you're getting emotional, either happy or sad. It is key in these times of chaos and tumult to stay grounded, to stay calm and reasonable and rational. And the only way you're going to do that is standing on primary sources. That is the only granite that there is. It's the only way you're going to know. And so here we are predicting the future by telling the past. I mean, I've been talking about the technate for a long time. Technocracy, scientific expertness. We've taken it all the way back to Sweden and the cameralist movement and going right into the Enlightenment period. This is really where it comes from. However, I digress. You should be looking at the little cockleffel, the stirring spoon, Felix Frankfurter. It was Frankfurter's hot dogs. Kid you not, that was their name, who were very influential in New Deal legislation. This is the final steps of Brandeis's vision of an administrative state. You can see how he got a ton of work done under Wilson, but then had to wait for 3 presidents until he could get to FDR. And these guys all knew FDR. FDR was actually working under Felix Frankfurter in World War I. Let me just show you a picture. See if I can do it. I showed this before. Let's see if it's quick. I'll show you. If it gets complicated, we're out of here. Oh, look at that. So this is a major historic photo. So stop this share. Bring up this other one. Not many people have seen this, and there is incredible power in this one photograph. Okay, you guys should be looking at a young Franklin Delano Roosevelt on his right to our left, the father of modern journalism, Walter Lippmann. And then on the right is Secretary of the Navy, and his name is escaping me right now, but he's in the Council on National Defense. He's one of the fascists. This is the public or the government aspect combining with the corporations. You see, it's happening. And so FDR was a secretary to this man here. And Walter Lippmann was direct secretary to the Secretary of War, Newton Deal Baker. These guys are really, especially Lippmann, Frankfurter, and Brandeis, are the ones that steer America into war. Now, the last thing I want to point your attention to is this map in the background. Central Europe. Okay, so Lippmann is the very first founding lifetime member of Council on Foreign Relations. And he is that because he was the first given the portfolio to create the inquiry, which becomes it's the predecessor to the CFR. And what is it? What are they doing? But drawing maps. They're redrawing Central Europe, or otherwise known as the Polish-Lithuanian corridor, otherwise known as the Palub settlement. War's been going on there literally for hundreds of years. Extraordinary photo, no? So more on that map and the relationship between these men later. Bring up Felix Frankfurter again. No, it's him that receives the memorandum. If you've watched the inquiry work, the three-part series on the inquiry, part one shows in the first 2 minutes that it's the memorandum sent to this guy that initiates the creation of the inquiry. And what are they doing? But they're creating the argument that they're going to take to the Paris Peace Conference. This is really how they establish the American century, 1919. That Paris Peace Conference, if you're unfamiliar with it, I've done tons of work on it. Just go to the history of propaganda. It's a three-part series, the inquiry, or the founders of the CFR. So you want to talk about reckless U.S. foreign policy and our move away from non-interventionalists to intervening in every single conflict on the planet or on Earth. All non-observant Reform Judaists, somewhere in there, mostly secular. So Brandeis personally put Frankfurter in position as professor of law. Brandeis personally put Frankfurter in position as professor of law at Harvard Law School and made him editor of the Harvard Law Review, the very organ that Brandeis founded. Frankfurter would eventually be named Byrne Professor of Administrative Law, of all things, in 1924. Brandeis also funded Frankfurter for at least the first years. Other financial help for Frankfurter coming from some other names you may have heard before: Jacob Schiff, Julian Mack, Paul and Felix Warburg, Julius Rosenwald, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., Learned Hand. All Harvard. Well, I'm not sure if they're all Harvard, but those last, certainly Holmes, Learned Hand. The others all Jews, all Zionists, all the hardcore circle around Brandeis. This is what they called. There's a soft core and a hardcore. Those are all the hardcore, including Frankfurter. Frankfurter this is where he got his reputation as being the stirring spoon, because he had his foot in every administrative door at the Paris Peace Conference. And I could show you incredible provenance. We're going to actually get to that in these 3 or 4 podcasts I'm going to do in a row. We'll get to all of that. James T. Shotwell's involvement, creation of the ILO. These guys all center around labor for a reason. It's the one thing that unites every human being. This is what they're looking for, right? All the way to the Club of Rome. They're looking for something that unites us all. So then they can manipulate us. So Frankfurter's role is to identify the law students most well-suited to their plans and create and maintain a feeder system for both Holmes and Brandeis. This relationship would span from when Frankfurter left the House of Truth for his Harvard professorship in 1914 until his leaving Harvard for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court himself on January 5th, 1939. Brandeis and Frankfurter overlap at the U.S. Supreme Court for 1 year. And Frankfurter would eventually retire from the Supreme Court on August 29th, 1962, due to a heart attack. So 1916 is when Brandeis gets confirmed as U.S. Supreme Court Justice after much debate and conflict. Many people did not want to see Louis D. Brandeis become the first Jewish U.S. Supreme Court justice, so it took 6 months to confirm him after nomination by Woodrow Wilson, and only to be outdone by Felix Frankfurter when he was elected. And so you can see 1916 to 1962, those guys overlap for 1 year and span 46 years, nearly 50 years. And with the main intent of overthrowing the US Constitution and flipping the definition of liberalism from classic to neo-radical. So, quote, after Brandeis' death, his clerks honored the memory and service of their former employer in a variety of ways. Several of them published tribute pieces in law reviews and legal journals. In the decades following the justice's passing, arguably becoming the originators of a literary tradition now followed by scores of former law clerks from all levels of federal and state courts. Page 88, Isaiah and his young disciples. They're calling Brandeis Isaiah, as FDR did. Here's our man, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Mephistopheles, the devil incarnate. This is what he called himself, Mephistopheles. So quote, Frankfurter is certain to be ranked with two of his friends, Justice Holmes and Brandeis, as a giant figure in the shaping of American constitutional law, end quote. Felix Frankfurter dies. Retired judge, was 82. Hartford Crimson, February 23rd, 65. No author attribution. So his apologists say, quote, shaping American constitutional law, end quote, as if it's supposed to be shaped, altered, or moved. Exactly, right? The Constitution was known to be a bedrock. It's not supposed to move. Our freedom to speak freely and think freely isn't supposed to change. So those that are calling for our representatives to respect U.S. Constitution, you got to understand that it was flipped well over 100 years ago, even before your grandparents and even your grandparents were born. We must come to this realization. We must come to the truth, as Harvard says. So Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., for those wondering about the clerks that worked for him, Thomas Corcoran, Alger and Donald Hiss, Skull and Bonesman, George L. Harrison, and Harvey Hollister Bundy, father of William and McGeorge Bundy. We see when combining the clerks of Holmes and Brandeis the makings of FDR's brain trust and an ominous continuity of progressive government well into the 20th century now. Into the 30s we go. So Brandeis deliberately steered his disciples away from private law practice, instead wanting more from each of them, urging them, each of his 21 clerks, to become missionaries. This is quote, for the progressive cause and the advancement of sociological jurisprudence. To pursue larger ideals, Brandeis wanted them to become influential members of the management class, educators, teachers, and the continued advancement throughout the century of Brandeisian law, and to protect the Brandeis legacy. From Isaiah and his young disciples. If one pours through the biographical materials on Brandeis and Holmes, it quickly becomes apparent that these clerks are the chief defendants of their respective judges' place in the judicial pantheon. They become the caretakers and curators of reputations. Okay. Well, why do I have this here? Because I think these two are related. If not directly related. The time matches. You look at the timeline, and there's similarities in their facial structures for certain. And I'm not the only one to notice it. So here he is from Brandeis and his clerks. David Reisman, October term 1935, was one of the few clerks to meet with Brandeis. prior to his clerkship. The thing with Brandeis that most of them say is he's very distant. There was no personal relationships being made here. It was very much do as Brandeis says. See here, H. Thomas Austin, former law clerk, describes Brandeis as a combination of Jesus Christ and a Hebrew prophet, confessing that in the first few months I was scared to death of him. Austin's description is echoed by Fisher, who recalls that his first impression was that Justice Brandeis seemed to be a combination of Isaiah the prophet, Abraham Lincoln. So from Dean Acheson, who I introduced you to in the last show, if you didn't know who he was already, he's one of the wise men, direct clerk of Brandeis, stating, the justice was an arresting figure, his head of Lincolnian cast and grandeur, the same boldness and ruggedness of features, the same untamed hair, the eyes of infinite depth under bushy eyebrows, which in moments of emotion seemed to jut out. It's Dean Acheson right here. Key in Cold War rhetoric, the extension of all of this into the 40s, 50s. Many of you will have already heard of that guy. So, to his disciples, Brandeis was generally very distant and indifferent. Their relationship strictly professional. Brandeis spoke frankly. For many, it would be months before they felt entirely comfortable in his presence. And his clerks were kept in the dark, receiving very little advice from Frankfurter before being fed to the wolf. So Brandeis' list of disciples, an impressive one, including future Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, Dean of Harvard Law School and Chairman of the SEC, John Landis, Chief Judge, U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit Attorney, William Sutherland, Judge, U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, Henry Friendly, Dean, Georgetown University Law Center, Arms Control Negotiator, Adrian Sanford Fisher, Dean, Yale Law School, Harry Schulman, Deans of Harvard Law School, Louis Jaffe, Paul Freund, and Henry Hart Jr., Wisconsin School of Law professors, William Rice Jr. and James Hurst, Professor, Harvard Law School, William McCurdy, President of Amtrak and Chairman of the FTC, William Claytor Jr., President of Phelps Dodge Corporation, Robert Page, and others went on to private practice. We see an interesting array of careers, not so surprising when knowing Brandeis' immense influence on American case and constitutional law, the Supreme Court, Harvard Law School, railroads, industry, labor, security, privacy, U.S. Secretaries of State. We see them all represented in his clerks. Progress of science and furnishing the government with means of espionage is not likely to stop with wiretapping. So there's an interesting story here where Brandeis actually predicts that television will one day record us. And everybody laughed. So we see in Acheson, who's Skull and Bones, and Benjamin V. Cohen, who's a part of the FDR Brain Trust and part of this House of Truth 2.0, both lead attorneys for the National Consumers League during the New Deal. Now, we've already associated Brandeis with the National Consumers League. So how Brandeis' clerk continued to reform society with his method of using sociological facts and data collected in a brief. We are still deeply immersed in this kind of culture today where statistics, facts, and data steer mathematical models, turning into policy and law. So Justice Louis Brandeis left the Supreme Court in 1939, but in many ways his clerkship model has become the standard for the clerkship institution. That's the conclusion from Isaiah and his disciples. So Dean Acheson, like so many others, was stricken by Brandeis' physical similarity to Abraham Lincoln, writing in his memoirs, quote, his head of Lincolnian cast and grandeur, the same boldness and ruggedness of features, the same untamed hair, the eyes of infinite depth under bushy eyebrows, which in moments of emotion seem to jut out as I've read, but worth repeating. So DARPA in 2015 named their domestic surveillance program after Brandeis. Brandeis even predicting in his famous warrantless wiretapping case, Olmsted versus the United States in 1928, that television would one day be able to watch, listen, and record people in their own homes. Brandeis amazingly revealing the actual intent of television technology. He foresaw a time of total information awareness or full spectrum dominance, and it shouldn't come as a surprise. Brandeis started it all with many precedent-setting cases in surveillance, personal privacy, sterilization, sedition, censorship, antitrust labor, law, and so on and so on. In 2015, DARPA named their domestic surveillance program after Brandeis. I began that paragraph and ended it with that sentence. But again, worth repeating. He's doing the very first sterilization. Him and Oliver Wendell Holmes. See Buck versus Bell. We want to talk eugenics, social hygiene, spilling into the MK Ultra Macy conferences and all of this. Machinating in the 70s and 80s as the changing images of man study. So another disciple, H. Thomas Austin, who we've talked about already, saw his mentor as a combination between Jesus Christ and the Hebrew prophet. Well, Fisher stated Brandeis seemed to be a combination of Isaiah the prophet and Abraham Lincoln. A raw-boned characteristic, he had a rough-hewn look and a grave, almost diffident courtesy. So here's a list of the 21 Brandeisian law clerks. You can take a moment there. Some of the names may jump out at you. There's James Macaulay Landis. Dean Gooderham Acheson. So now that we've established Brandeis as one of the founding fathers of American regulation and influential figure at Harvard, how exactly did he do it? What was his method of operation? Legislation is the act of creating laws, while regulation is the process of creating rules that define how laws are applied. Here's how Brandeis, an expert at both legislation and regulation on the local, state, and federal level, set precedent in how to both create and then define the application of law with his revolutionary Brandeis Brief. Go look it up. This Brandeis Brief is essential, still looked to today as the founding of our modern system of law, where an emphasis on sociological data. This is where the social sciences start influencing law. Social sciences coming from Frankist origins. So Brandeis and the NAACP. Although Brandeis himself would forego public activism on behalf of American blacks, his signature approach to lawyering and legal analysis would later provide sympathetic lawyers and judges with the tools and inspiration they would need to bring the national policy of segregation to its knees. For instance, the NAACP would build upon the role of lawyer as public advocate pioneered by Brandeis when it established a legal defense fund to finance litigation efforts aimed at dismantling the segregation system. Civil rights lawyers also would adopt Brandeis's signature style of brief writing, the so-called Brandeis Brief, which made generous use of sociological data to support legal arguments, end quote. It's Alabama Law Review, Louis Brandeis and the Race Question, Christopher A. Bracey, volume 52. Take a moment. So we can find something here that would help everybody see. How was it? You guys have a good time? Anybody ever looked at the Freeman's Memorial? Anybody know what that is? I'll show you right now. The Emancipation of the Slaves by Abraham Lincoln. Should be looking at it now. It's famous. See these here? It's fasces. So really, he wasn't emancipating the slaves as much as he was putting them into the factory. They needed people to build their war machines. This is the first fascist here. We look at fascism's definition as a public-private partnership. Military preparedness, scientific efficiency, see very clearly. Men like Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, these are some of the first, what we call fascists, because they define it. So when you look at this image here, similar, isn't it? Yeah, there's no fasces there. It's replaced by his wife and child. Interesting. It's malice toward none with charity for all. You can see it's Theodore Roosevelt there. So road to hell is paved with good intentions, and it's the lies that you do not detect hidden behind nice sounding words that fool us, and they've been fooling us for a long time. And it's words just like that. So Bracy claiming herein that after considerable investigation of his own, he had failed to find any public record of Brandeis advocating for the Black American at all. So he asks, if his record shows an absence of actual opinion, what exactly did Brandeis do for the civil rights movement? Bracy's paper caused friction in academic circles, yet Brandeis's record is there for all to see. Bracy's argument is valid, and this further substantiates our thought that Brandeis's main interest throughout, like that of Lincoln and Roosevelt, wasn't about civil rights, as we think of them, but the standardization of an inclusive new model of wage slavery being imposed under nice sounding, soothing words and comfortable, soft pictures like this one. So from African Americans and Euro Americans, from Brandeis and the race question, page 861. In short, Brandeis is considered an icon in American legal culture because we purport to understand his public-spirited approach to the law as having elevated our expectations of lawyers and judges and transformed our perceptions of the purpose of law in civilized society. Yet there is an aspect of Brandeis's life, one that routinely escapes mention in the historical literature, that gives rise to a far more powerful critique of his celebrated image, namely his conspicuous evasion of public issues that dealt with inter-ethnic relations between African Americans and Euro Americans. And so while Bracy does rightly identify a very historically significant void in Brandeis's humanitarian record and suggests, in fairness, we may need to look deeper into the lives of other justices, he doesn't delve any deeper into Brandeis. Bracy, perhaps being blinded by the same revelatory light cast upon the rest of his historiographer friends, fails to put the entire mosaic together because they're siloed. So given Brandeis's familiarity with the issues facing Blacks in American society, his reputation for public vanguardism and social responsibility, and his purportedly strong predisposition toward vindicating the rights of common people, one naturally would assume he was among the first to confront such obvious and rampant public injustices. Yet Brandeis failed to author a single opinion in any of the race cases heard by the court. More importantly, Brandeis voted with the majority of the court in every one of these cases, some of which served to reinforce the core principles of racial stratification and subordination of blacks in American society. Again, from Brandeis and the race question. So here we see the main argument against Brandeis, that much of what Brandeis set in place actually worked against the interests of the minorities he claimed to support. He further deepened harmful stereotypes and racial stratifications. Instead of freeing the blacks, he helped to undermine their cause by attaching a persecution complex, forever subjugating the Negro with a sense of futility in his own mind. So what they do to all minorities. The civil rights movement itself has served to exploit the black race, to further entrench the thought of victimhood and enhance the thought of systemic disparity. In an example of how Brandeis skirted the racial question, an example offered by Bracy in the personal letters of Brandeis himself. Brandeis's largely unknown role of counsel for the NAACP, another strangely underreported aspect of his life, and that Brandeis advised the NAACP's early moves, giving advice to Florence Kelley and other NAACP founders on how best to initiate social change. We remember Florence Kelley, right? Where she's from, Consumers League. She helps Brandeis create the very, very, very first Brandeis Brief. In an example of how Brandeis skirted the racial question, Bracy points to a case the NAACP was taking up against the Interstate Commerce Commission for failing to eliminate discrimination in railroad facilities. Brandeis received a letter from the NAACP Secretary of the Board of Directors, Miss May Childs Nerney, dated September 10th, 1914, asking for his assistance, and pay particular attention to how Brandeis interacts, firstly on September 18th. This is from Brandeis. So far as I know, I shall be in the city on next Wednesday and could see you at 11 o'clock on that day. I have great doubt, however, that it would be worth your while to come to Boston for that purpose alone, as it does not seem possible that I should give you any advice of value in regard to the Jim Crow car situation. So he's really staying several degrees separate from the entire civil rights movement. This is really ultimately, we got moved from natural law and what was laid down in the Constitution to being under civil law. This is already a step away from where we're supposed to be. Yet we sit there and look at the crowd in the background clamoring for civil rights, to be ruled by a state. We cheer. In a letter later of the same thread, on September 29th, Brandeis reiterated to NAACP Board Attorney Chapin Brinsmade and another NAACP founder, Oswald Garrison Villard, that the best approach was to file a, quote, formal petition with the commission seeking redress for failure to provide reasonable accommodations on such railroads as appeared to be particularly serious offenders, and be prepared to make full proof in those cases, end quote. Identifying an injustice, demanding redress. This is why I say it, because he says it all the time. And redress is being used in the Protocols of Zion, by the way. Brandeis' answer was to involve a necessary social justice aspect, to not just wait for bureaucracy to get around to an investigation, but to provide the evidence to put the ICC in a position where they have little choice but to expedite the process or face public backlash. Here, Brandeis creating circumstances using critical theory, combining the Marxists with Edward Bernays. And the Brandeis Brief became the working model and most effective tool of change for not only the NAACP, but all social activist organizations across the board forever after. So from NAACP history, Florence Kelley sought the help of Louis Brandeis, who was at that time counsel for the Consumers League. Brandeis advised the association that the best approach was to petition the commission for relief, citing definite cases in support of their contention. So from NAACP, a history of the National Associations of Colored People, which is largely founded by non-colored people. Thereupon, the NAACP board dispatched Montgomery Gregory of Howard University to collect evidence and take pictures of Jim Crow car conditions in the Deep South. By the end of 1915, Arthur Springer and the legal committee had almost perfected the cases, which were to have been presented by Brandeis. Brandeis was appointed to the United States Supreme Court in January 1916, however, and Albert Pillsbury agreed to make the presentation. So they had Brandeis scheduled to be the lead attorney there, but he had to take the seat at the U.S. Supreme Court. So the NAACP adopting and then building upon the role of lawyer as public advocate pioneered by Brandeis when it established a legal defense fund to finance litigation efforts aimed at dismantling the segregation system. Civil rights lawyers also would adopt Brandeis' signature style of brief, writing the so-called Brandeis Brief, which made generous use of sociological data to support legal arguments. Alabama Law Review. Okay, so conclusion. From Brandeis, A Free Man's Life, of the books I just showed you, progressive legislation during the first Wilson administration exceeded that passed in nearly 12 years under Roosevelt and Taft. These new measures embodied many of Brandeis' suggestions, yet were far from being all that he thought necessary. Before the antitrust and other acts he had fathered were through the mill, he was urging legislation on more fronts. Here he was too early. It was not until 20 years later that his theories came alive in such New Deal measures as the Securities Act of 1933. So we're talking New Deal. As I said, he had to wait through 3 presidents. Brandeis and his form of regulation largely formed from the Brandeis Brief, first used in law legislation and adopted as tradition. And we see him using it with the National Consumers' League, the NAACP, and the ACLU, his influence emanating from Harvard Law School still to this day. His name is coming up today more than it has in a long time because they're setting that precedent. The technocrats owe everything to Brandeis. He's the one that coined the term scientific management. And that book has a fasces. So Brandeis never once during his entire time on the Supreme Court dissented in a racial discrimination case of blacks. He voted with the majority every time. When it came to the prosecution of communists during and after the First World War, Brandeis wasn't afraid of risking his reputation in defending their rights to speak freely, and then spoke in terms of everyone being deserving of foundational concepts such as liberty and the democratic process. There was a first Red Scare, long before McCarthyism. So from Shelley v. Kramer and Brown v. Board of Education. Oops, sorry. Did it again. From Alabama Law Review, page 900. In the coming years, the use of social science data to quantify the harms of racial prejudice would become the bread and butter of civil rights brief writing, culminating in tremendous sociological data-driven victories in Shelley v. Kramer and Brown v. Board of Education. Cartoons in the day. There's Brandeis, Uncle Sam giving somebody a spanking. So Bracey, like everyone else, looking into the life of Brandeis, finds contradiction, yet fails to put the puzzle picture together in its entirety, instead choosing to stay with the easier border pieces or smaller sections. Interesting to note, Bracey contends 4 possible reasons for Brandeis' absence while in such a position to help the plight of the African American, but finds all 4 insufficient explanations in themselves. Left to speculate, he never finds the true reason. Moorfield Story, the president of the NAACP from its beginning until his death, argued that racial mixing was desirable, and segregation laws worked directly against this desired racial amalgamation. Here again, we see they weren't emancipating the black slave, they were just releasing him from solitary confinement, allowing him to congregate freely with the white prison population. And sole purpose of emancipation was efficiency of governance. Here we claim the same conspiracy many did then of a plan being executed through the NAACP of race amalgamation. Rather than freeing the black from enslavement, they were merely making a business decision to standardize the slave trade and mix the different colored chattel. Brandeis' dominant role in American legislation and then regulation is certainly celebrated among the intelligentsia today. His work first with Brandeis and Warren, and then Brandeis, Dunbar, and Nutter in Boston and New York. Then his state work in Washington have made the Brandeis name and regulation nearly synonymous. Brandeis coining the term regulated competition, preferred shop, scientific management. Beatrice Webb coining collective bargaining, industrial relations. So Brandeis' early role in the regulation of the Boston and Washington street subway systems set the trail, and much national and state regulation followed. The Boston and Maine New Haven Railroad merger, the 1902 anthracite case, the 1910 Colliers-Bollinger investigation, 1910 New York garment workers strike, the advanced rate case, the Boston and Maine New Haven merger. Brandeis is deeply involved in all of that. In a similar fashion to how Edward Filene would bring Brandeis into the negotiations during the 1910 Triangle Shirtwaist strike that resulted in the Protocol of Peace, we see Brandeis being suggested to labor attorney Clarence Darrow by muckraker Henry Demarest Lloyd. Those are socialists. Together, they gathered all the sociological data needed and then applied the Brandeis Brief in one of the most famous strike cases in American history. This pattern we see repeated several times throughout the Rise of the Experts series, where Brandeis would enter a room of high-level attorneys and leave their undisputed leader, or his reputation preceded him, and he walked in the door already the leader. His attachment to the state and the National Consumers' League, an influential elixir. So the partnership of Louis D. Brandeis and the National Consumers' League in the preparation of sociological briefs for the defense of labor legislation was by no means accidental. Brandeis has an enormous reputation among reformers of the century's first decade, for he early applied his brilliant legal mind to solving specific labor relation problems. In 1902, he provided advice for Clarence Darrow, who presented the mine workers' case before the Anthracite Coal Strike Commission created by Theodore Roosevelt. It's from the National Consumers' League in the Brandeis Brief. And famously, it's Frankfurter that orders the kidnapping of all of the miners in Bisbee and takes them into Mexico and drops them off because they're not happy with their conditions. So as we learned in Brandeis Part 6, The Science of Law, there is no form of social control more specialized or efficient than law. The legislative and regulatory process ensures long-term compliance among the vast majority of people. Brandeis, the nationally known man of the people, was spearheading the movement as preeminent counsel of the National Consumers' League. And by training a generation of the leading social activists and lawyers in the Brandeis Brief method, Brandeis again ensuring a legacy upheld for generations, now centuries, by his progressive enablers is hard to penetrate. And despite articles like Bracey's and investigations like ours, Brandeis' life and afterlife remain a riddle wrapped in scholasticism hidden inside academia. So from the National Consumers' League and the Brandeis Brief, after Muller versus Oregon, in which the assistance of Louis Brandeis was obtained for the state by the National Consumers' League, there were more calls for help than could be answered. Soon afterwards, Attorney General Timothy Hogan sought the assistance of Brandeis for the defense of the Ohio Workmen's Compensation Act, page 284. So you can see he's a wanted man. Everybody wants Brandeis as much as Wilson for everything. This is what Wilson said. You can see that he is most certainly the people's attorney and being called to all kinds of problems, and what he does is resolve them. So Brandeis' genius is really in taking two opposites and resolving them into one. And what is that but dialectics? And where did Brandeis go to school? In his adolescent years. Germany. So attorney Charles Henry Butler, whose family had been on the Supreme Court for a century, said that fellow Brandeis has got the impudence of the devil to bring his socialism into the Supreme Court. And as we're showing, it's in Greenwich Village in New York, where these guys all get together and create the League for Industrial Democracy, which is really the definition of democracy today. Okay, so here we have J.P. Morgan, depicted in Puck magazine as a colossus, pushing out old divine right, commercial might versus divine right, the modern trust king, J.P. Morgan, brings dismay to the old kings of Europe. This is in the lead up to the First World War. Okay, so that's a fairly quick run through of the Brandeis, The Social Justice, from the book Prophets of Regulation and several others. Hope that helps you understand it. It's through administrative, legislative, regulatory changes that the New World Order has actually been able to infiltrate and flip our modern day social contract. And Louis Brandeis, again, is one of the keys. All right, so appreciate your time. I'll look for another show tomorrow or maybe later today. We'll see how I feel. All right, so thank you again. We'll see you next time.